Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. We're moving on to game number 5 in the match between Lasker and Bird. Lasker currently leads 2 wins to 0, and both of those wins have come with the black pieces, as he's playing again today. So as I've mentioned before, the onus is really on Bird to either prove that his Bird's opening is actually worth something, or switch to an opening that will accomplish a little bit more. Let's see how that happened today. With the first move, Bird stuck to his guns and once more played pawn to f4. Lasker again responded with pawn to d5, and after knight to f3 again went back to his fianchetto defense that has served him well in the previous 2 games with g6. e3, bishop to g7, bishop to e2, knight to f6, castles and castles. Now this is a position that has been played many times over, although not necessarily in this time period. For example, the most popular move in this position is d3. It wouldn't be played for a while, but for example, one of the model games that was played relatively close to this one took place in 1936, between 2 legends of the game, one of the hyper-modern pioneers, Saviele Tartakower, and one of the old guard of the classical system, Geza Moroczy. That saw c5 from Mr. Moroczy, and now a very classic hyper-modern piece shuffle, queen to e1, knight to c6, bishop to d1, queen to c7, excuse me, and now Tartakower finally broke in the center with e4. D captures e4, D captures e4, e5, f captures e5, knight captures e5, knight captures e5, queen captures e5 was played. Now Moroczy doubtlessly got the advantage in this game, getting to play against his opponent's isolated pawn, but the ultimate result in the end was a draw. Now Bird, as is often the case, did not play the most popular move. He instead opted to go for b3, and Lasker immediately challenged this by playing knight to e4, putting the knight on a square that was previously covered in the other line, and also opening up this attack on the rook. So Bird has to answer the question of how is he going to respond to this attack. In his notes for the game, Amos Byrne believed that the correct path was for white to play the move d4. The criticism I can levy against this is that it leads to immediate conflict with c5. White's going to play bishop to b2, and after c captures d4, bishop captures d4, black develops with tempo going to c6 with the knight. Bishop captures on g7, king captures on g7, and now white's best path, I imagine, is to play against this central pawn with c4, and after d captures on c4, bishop captures on c4, here black gets to develop with queen to b6 going after this weak e-pawn, and in the future they have very easy developing moves like bishop to g4, rook to d8, rook to c8, and overall I do believe that black should have won this opening. So instead of d4, Bird decided to put his pawn on c3 instead, and rather than push c5, Lasker immediately played knight to c6. Now, I found a 2010 game between, and I apologize if I butcher this name pronunciation, Stefan Brinz and Jesper Tyborg, where bishop to b5 was played. Bird decided to touch his other bishop. He played bishop to b2, and this move is a novelty, so it is as of move 8 that the players are playing a unique game. Lasker continued his development by playing rook to e8, and after d3 from Bird kicking the knight back to d6, it is very important that either here or honestly on the previous move, Bird plays the move d4, because with Lasker's previous 2 developing moves, he is very clearly hinting at the fact that he wants to thrust forward with e5. Bird did not play d4, he instead played knight to a3, and now he has to face the consequences of e5. Now, fundamentally, black getting 2 pawns in the center like this should just means that principally they're better. We can take a look at one of the forcing variations to show why concretely black is better. For example, if we take twice on e5, f captures e5, knight captures e5, knight captures, and bishop captures e5. One of black's most crude threats in this position is to play, for example, queen to h4, going after the h2 pawn. White can defend this by playing, for example, queen to e1, but now black can continue developing with knight to f5, attacking the e-pawn. White can defend this through knight to c2, and black develops once more with queen to d6, renewing this attack on the h2 pawn. Now here, probably the most straightforward way for white to defend is to put the pawn on g3, and we're getting a little bit deep into the variations, so I don't want to necessarily compute all of the complexities, but I will just end this point by saying it is possible for black to sacrifice on g3. Knight captures g3, h captures g3, bishop captures g3 is totally fine, and black should have something like the better position in all of these complexities. Bird did not take on e5, only now did he push his pawn to d4, but now it's too late. Lasker took on f4, e captures f4, e captures f4, and before committing to anything concrete, retreats his knight back to e7. So now the problem that Bird faces is that Lasker's knights are prepared to jump back to e4 and also to f5. This is a very powerful square that can only really be kicked if Bird wants to push g4, which is dangerous to say the least. So Bird has to prove that he has some sort of either attack or other positional advantage to compensate for the fact that Lasker's knights are about to become very active. So Bird starts with as good a move as any. He brings his knight back down to c2. Lasker reinforces his center by putting his pawn on c6, and Bird improves his bishop to d3. Lasker meets this by developing his own bishop at last to the f5 square, and Bird captures here, which I cannot understand. It makes no sense to me. Later on in the game, Bird plays the move knight to e5, which is a perfectly fine move here. And for example, if it were Lasker who would trade, bishop captures d3, queen captures d3, and knight e to f5, we reach a position in the game where white is actually up 2 tempi, and I don't think I need to explain why that's better. Now, to be clear, black doesn't have to take on this move. You don't have to play bishop captures on d3. You can play improving moves like queen somewhere, queen c7, queen a5, whatever. But it's just to demonstrate the point. Because compare that to what we get in the game. Bishop captures f5, knight e captures f5, queen to d3, Lasker played knight to e4, and only now did Bird play knight to e5. Now compare this with the analysis line that I just showed. This black knight was on d6, and it was white to move, hence being 2 tempi up. So I don't think it takes too much convincing to say that this is just a strictly worse position for Bird. Now, to be fair to both players, the nuances of the position might not matter all that much if neither one of them makes the time control, so let's get there. Lasker played rook to c8, this is his 17th move, both players have 3 more to make. Bird developed his rook to d1. Lasker continued rook to c7, and now Bird struck in the center with c4. Here, Lasker decided to go for a quick bishop remaneuver, where he played bishop to f8, and after rook to f3, his 20th move was bishop to d6, thus reaching the time control. Now, both players, I believe, have been rather transparent with their intentions leading up to the time control. Lasker, with his previous 2 moves, has relocated his bishop to a square where it is not blocked in when he gets to play this move f6, kicking back Bird's very strong knight. This is an especially salient point because Bird put his rook on f3, which is a square that the knight could have retreated to. Bird, meanwhile, does what he likes to do all the time and initiates a kingside attack. He put his rook on f3 so that he could move it over to h3. This was a move that met with a lot of criticism, though the alternatives provided weren't necessarily all that inspiring either. Rook d to f1 was the move that Amos Byrne gave, but the problem is that here white just gets kicked around, starting with f6. This knight has to retreat to g4, and believe it or not, black is actually perfectly within their rights to even play the move h5. This kicks the knight down to e3, and after knight captures on e3, I don't know which way you want to recapture, either with the rook, or let's say we'll take knight captures on e3 to get an attack on the d-pawn. Here black is able to undevelop their bishop once more, put it back on f8, adding the queen as a defender to the d-pawn, and now, if it was black to move, they would get to play this move f5, completely locking down the king side, preventing all further attacks, and then this bishop is free to return to the long diagonal on g7, putting pressure on white's d-pawn. This would be an absolutely miserable position for white, and I would imagine Lasker loving to push this. Now, when Bird played rook to h3, what was his intended response to f6, which is what Lasker played? He wanted to get an attack going right away with g4. Now, this certainly does look like a counterattack, but I'm not sure precisely what Bird expected from this. Lasker, of course, played f captures on e5. G captures on f5 will be explained in a moment, as what took place in the game. F captures on e5 looks like an interesting alternative at first. You're attacking 2 minor pieces, and so in a sense, white does win a pawn here. The problem is that black has a very strong resource in knight to h4. This square is still protected by the queen. If white takes the bishop on d6, then this rook slides to f7. The other rook can very easily go to f8, and it's actually the white king that is super exposed and might just get checkmated here. Bird instead opted to play c captures on d5, whose idea I can imagine as being trying to remove the defender of the e4 knight, but the problem is that Lasker has a very efficient response here in e captures on f4, opening up the rook's defense and removing a crucial pawn in the f-pawn. This is because after g captures on f5, which is what Bird played here, now Lasker gets to take advantage of the undefended g5 square and played queen to g5 check. And in his notes, Amos Byrne noted that this move marks the beginning of the end. Bird moved out of the check by playing king to f1, and Lasker retook on d5. So if nothing else, Lasker is up a pawn, but of course he's winning slightly more than that. Bird here attacked the rook on e8 with queen to b5, and now I just have to point out that the computer recommends here the needlessly vicious move rook captures on c2. The point being that after queen captures on e8, this does come with check, but after the king slides down to g7, you'll take a look around and you'll notice that white actually has no more useful checks. Black, meanwhile, threatens the very salient check queen to g2, which will of course just lead to checkmate. Black wins. Now, there is really no need for such barbarism. Lasker simply retreated his knight back to f6, defending the rook, and all is well, he's still completely winning. Bird retreated his queen back to d3, and Lasker took this pawn on f5 with his own pawn, g captures on f5. He still wants to go on an attack along the g file, but he doesn't necessarily want to give up the exchange to do so. And indeed, after bishop to c1, he put his queen on g4 to escape any x-rays, and following rook to d2, he simply slid his rook from c7 over to g7. Now the question Bird has to answer is, how does he meet the threatened queen to g1 with checkmate? Evidently, he could not find a good answer, because it was here on move 29 that Henry Bird resigned the game. So yeah, there's not really much to say about this game. Bird continues to make absolutely nothing good happen with the Bird's opening, and after 3 consecutive losses, I think now is the time to switch up the opening. Of course, we're going to have to wait a little bit to see that, because the next game will feature Lasker with white, who's also seeking his first white win. So I would like to believe that in the next few games, some opening switch-ups will be happening, which will of course be very entertaining. So, with the score standing 3-0 in favor of Lasker, there's still a fair amount of chess left to be played, so I'll look forward to seeing you in the future. Until then.